Thank you. So I'm here today to talk to you about macOS 26, what you need to know. So this is not the official Apple presentation where I'm going to tell you the good things and the bad things and the things you have to watch out for. To kind of elaborate on what Marcus said, I've been managing Mac since before the days of OS 10. I have been worked in the graphic arts business. I have hard hand-coded PostScript. I have dealt with Adobe before Creative Cloud. I was a consultant for a number of years, and then I worked at the National Institutes of Health, where I got exposure to fun things like smart cards and also in security compliance issues. And then the past 5 years I spent at SpaceX managing all of their Apple devices, including the 58 iPads set to orbit. In December, I made a transition to SAP, which is a very large enterprise software company. You heard of Apple reference the fact that they use them. They use SAP, and SAP uses Macs. We have over 50,000 Macs. About 50% of our client base is Macs, and growing. So SAP also does publish some free and open source tools. Some of you may have heard of Privileges, may used it. There's also SAP Power Monitor, there's Script to Package, and a number of things on GitHub. I stepped into the shoes of the infamous Rich Troughton, who I know is presented here, who's a personal friend of mine. Those are pretty big shoes to fill. I'm still trying to find my way. And as Marcus mentioned, I'm one of these crazy car nut guys who loves rear-wheel drive performance cars. And so as a result, I have 3 Holdens. Technically, I've owned 5. One got bought back because the dealership screwed it up, and another one, we won't talk about that one. I also had some fun misadventures. You have to worry about kangaroos. We have to worry about deer and raccoons. So I killed Rocket. That was before I went to SpaceX, I'll point out. So, okay. On to the meat of our presentation. We're going to talk about macOS 26 Tahoe. And a very unfortunate shortcut there from the... So, macOS 26 was introduced in June, as is Apple's, at the Worldwide Developer Conference. The big thing it's changing for us as admins is it unifies the version number. How many people have accidentally referred to macOS 18? Or iOS or iPadOS 15? Because you got to keep the version number straight. And I can't even remember what tvOS and watchOS are, So we are now going to this number scheme, which people say, well, this is just like Microsoft. Well, actually, if you're old enough and you worked with Illustrator 88, that was the first year-based thing. But it's really more the model of the car industry, where traditionally the 2026 models start appearing at the end of 2025, in the fall of 2025. So we're kind of going to that model. It is also funny that they named the OS Tahoe because there is a Chevrolet Tahoe SUV sold in the States, but that joke wouldn't fly here because you don't normally get it, except for a few export reviews. And this also helps me because the next year when I give this presentation, I won't have to guess the version number. Like I had to have it changed from 16 to 26. So we already know next year's OS will be macOS 27. One other side note, this actually was a topic point that came up today on Slack, where somebody's like, are these OSs going to ship the same date? Well, yes, they are, because they're all the same version number. They shipped the same date last year, so get used to them all dropping at once. When we talk about the OS, hardware requirements, you can pretty much look at it this way. A handful of Intel machines and all Apple Silicon. And this is the last release that will run on Intel. So if you have Intel devices in your environment, you probably should start looking at figuring out what your plan is to replace them over the next 12 to 15 months. And again, it's only a handful of the newer Intel Macs. There are some, even the 2020 MacBook Air is not supported on macOS 26. So again, you should spend the time to go through your Intel Macs and figure out a replacement plan for them. You also should look at your software because after macOS 27, the Rosetta emulation environment will be removed. So again, next year's OS will still support Rosetta. After that, we have a problem. Well, geez, all your software is compatible, right? Well, you got to be careful because you have to look at everything. You can use, for example, system information or the Mac evaluation utility to tell you about things in your system that you may not think about. Here's a big one. When I look here and I see this fax driver or raster to fax, these are HP printer driver things that are still Intel. So if I need this functionality for my print drivers, I'm going to have a hard time. And when macOS 28 ships. So, and similar with applications. There are some applications, Forescout Secure Connector, if you have to do any kind of Ethernet-based authentication, doesn't work. It is not Apple Silicon native. It's not universal, so it's only Intel. So that's going to stop working. And again, you can use Mac Evaluation Utility to also generate a list of applications. It's a very useful tool for admins if you're not familiar with it. I'll briefly touch on the consumer features. The biggest thing is the liquid glass interface, and everyone had an absolute cow over this. For those who've been in this game for a while, you remember it was iOS 8 had a massive redesign, and some of those betas were really rough. There were a lot of people complaining about the way that liquid glass looked in the earlier betas. Those of us who've been around the block a few times know that is going to change. It's exactly what it did. I like this meme because it kind of shows how things changed for the first 3 betas. They've actually been playing from more transparent to less transparent and then back to more transparent. You're seeing this change in every beta. Overall, I don't see why people are bent about it. It seems to work reasonably well. They seem to have addressed a lot of the glitches with dialogues. The funniest one that I remember was every time you minimized or maximized Outlook, it would move the traffic lights further and further apart. How do you do that, Microsoft? And there's some concern that, geez, there's been a lot of concern over the OS. Are we dealing with, is Apple kind of stealing from Vista because we have all these prompts for things like UAC had in Vista, and now we're getting an interface that might be similar to Windows Aero. So, for some consumer features, we get live activities. So if you use DoorDash or equivalent or Uber Eats, you can actually see where your stuff coming in on your Mac. You also get the phone app from iOS on macOS, and including the new features of call screening, where you can basically have it so somebody has to say who they are before your phone will ring, or hold assist if you have to be on hold for a long period of time. It'll basically take care of it for you and then call you when the other person's on the line. We also get the journaling app from iOS and iPadOS. A big one that shocked a lot of people is the Launchpad. There's 2 minds of people who use. There's people who really love Launchpad and people who don't. So apparently the people who don't won out. Also, there's been some interesting changes. Spotlight, you can use some command keys to change the search for applications or documents, or so you can be more specific in your searches through command keys. So they've made Spotlight more powerful. That has been one of those technologies built into macOS that's pretty good. We have it good compared to Windows search. Apple Intelligence. This slide used to say no new management keys, but then they added one for Xcode later on. So there is one key for external intelligence integrations, a different one than what they had previously. One nice improvement is if you're in an environment that has to restrict Apple Intelligence, users should no longer get notifications or badges saying their device is ready for it when they can't use it. You have some features like live translation of languages, some powerful features added to shortcuts, and then additional changes to the Image Playground app. But we want to talk about the enterprise features. No, not that enterprise. Probably the biggest one, which I think a lot of the sponsors here are probably both excited for and also a little scared of, is the MDM migration feature. So this is new in macOS 26 and also iOS and iPadOS that allows you to migrate from one MDM to another without having to wipe the device. Devices have to be on the new OS first. In Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager, you can establish that deadline, target date. If the user doesn't migrate before then, in theory, they get forced. If you don't establish a deadline, nothing gets forced. So what was the point of that? A bunch of considerations on this, and there have been some changes in the latest beta. For example, what happens if you're using MDMA and you've deployed a Wi-Fi profile to connect to your corporate network, and now you want to migrate MDMs? What happens when that device unenrolls from the existing MDM? The Wi-Fi profile gets removed. So this is an area that some changes have been made in later betas to allow you to connect to a guest network or something like that. Another concern is if you are one of those unfortunate souls that uses volume purchase program apps on macOS. They work about as well. They work. How great VPP apps are on iOS and iPadOS? they're exactly the opposite on macOS. They don't really work very well. There's been some changes in macOS 15 that prevented VPP apps from being updated when they're open, yet the users never get notifications. So suddenly, why do I have 20,000 old copies of Outlook on my fleet? So VPP apps are a pain, but there are cases like there are some apps like Xcode, Azure VPN that only exist in the App Store. So you have to use those, but be prepared to, as part of your MDM migration, you may need to remove those apps and then reinstall them from your new MDM.
Hey, Robert. I just got in our testing in Sequoia and Tahoe. You've seen when the Wi-Fi profile is removed, it stays connected.
Yeah, and that there's some interesting differences between macOS and iOS and iPadOS. macOS will tend to, if you yank and re-push a profile, macOS tends to stay connected. iOS and iPadOS don't. So, okay, how many people have had to deal with the pain of understanding about secure tokens or bootstrap tokens? So what are these things? So first of all, a secure token is a cryptographic key that allows the user to unlock a file vault encrypted disk. And traditionally in macOS, this is always the first user account that was created got this, which led to some fun experiences when people were creating hidden admin accounts that would get the secure token and then the user wouldn't get, so they could reboot their Mac and then couldn't log into it. Things like that. The bootstrap token is something that started on macOS, and Marcus actually told me last night it's now on iOS, iPadOS as well, for the rapid return to service. It's basically a key that allows the MDM to grant secure tokens and volume ownership. So there have been a lot of pain points for admins about what users have secure tokens and whether a bootstrap token is escrowed with your MDM. So there are some changes. The bootstrap token is now generated before any user accounts are created. So in theory, it should be escrowed to your MDM. If you have any workflows or scripts that depend on that first user account getting a secure token, you really need to test this stuff with macOS 26 because you can't make that assumption anymore. More fun, file vault keys. Most organizations that use file vault would like to have their keys escrowed in their MDM server. And this usually happens, but then if somebody, let's say somebody has a device that didn't go through automated device enrollment. They go through Setup Assistant, they enable File Vault, then they enroll in their MDM. Does that File Vault key get escrowed? No, it doesn't. So suddenly you don't have that key. Then the user needs to boot into recovery to reset their password, and they don't have a File Vault key, and then they're, what do I do now? So there's been a lot of effort to try to address this. There's a tool, a free and open source tool written by Elliot Jordan of Netflix called Escrow Buddy. That is a great solution. I've implemented this in a couple of different environments. It's pretty much one of those set it and forget it. Create your group of devices where you don't have a valid, either a key isn't escrowed or the key that is escrowed isn't valid. And a policy to install Escrow Buddy. It's a login agent plugin. Rather than forcing the user to run a self-service policy or run a command line to rotate that key, this will just do it the next time the user logs in. There's a fork of Escrow Buddy called Bootstrap Buddy that performs the same function for Bootstrap token. And an example of where you might need Bootstrap token if you want to use declarative software declarative MDM software updates. The MDM needs to have that Bootstrap token escrowed to basically force that device to reboot and install the update. And if you don't have it escrowed, it's not going to work. So one change in macOS 26 is it'll automatically rotate the file vault key when that profile is removed and then reinstalled. When is that likely to happen with macOS 26 if you're migrating MDMs? So they've kind of taken some of the pain out of this for you. So anybody who has dealt with having a Mac as a server, whether it be something like a caching server or something like that, some kind of CI/CD, what's the one, and especially if that server is going to be not at your desk, in a closet somewhere, what's the one thing you don't want to do? You don't want to encrypt it, because what happens if you reboot in a file vault encrypted Mac? It sits at the pre-boot screen where it's not on, where normally it's not on the network, and you have to authenticate to it. So if it's in a data center, that means somebody wheeling in there with a crash cart and plugging in a keyboard and mouse to enter a password. So generally, most organizations have found some way to exclude these devices from their mandatory file vault encryption. Well, this is an interesting new thing in macOS 26. You can unlock at that file vault pre-boot window via SSH. Now, the caveat is this will not work with smart cards or SSH keys. It requires username and password. But it's kind of an interesting development. It wouldn't be a new macOS version without getting more prompts for users. And the biggest one that users may see on macOS 26 is a dialog that says, hey, this application is running background processes. So there's been some changes in the various macOS betas on this. And basically, you can leverage the same. If you remember the days of macOS 13, when Apple gave users the ability to turn off things like launch daemons and launch agents and system extensions, and every user would. So Apple had to retrofit a means to use the background task management profile. There are 4 different ways you could do this. You could use the team identifier, which is kind of like an Apple assigned developer code. You could use a label, which is typically the com.apple.whatever, com.jamp.whatever. A label prefix, you could just say com.apple. Usually not a good idea to exclude, to allow things on a allow list like that. Or the application's bundle identifier, com.microsoft.outlook. So in macOS 26, these same controls will prevent those dialogues from appearing, but only a couple of them. Team identifier is now, before when Apple did this, there was no real guidance which you should use. So I think a lot of people like myself said, I'll just use label. Well, now if I want to suppress these dialogues in macOS 26, I probably want to use team identifier first, bundle identifier second. So, and in general, I know at my previous role, I implemented these things for macOS 13, never looked at them in 14. And then, had to refactor them for macOS 15 because we may have changed security tools or some things I didn't put in there. This is a good time to run that sudo sfl tool dump btm command to generate this long list of all the things that could be disabled by the user. And that'll give you the team identifiers, the bundle identifiers, the labels, etc. So you can then use your MDM or favorite profile creation tool to create the appropriate tools. The one question that I think Eric asked is why do you think we're getting these dialogues about background processes running? Apple Silicon Macs are great because they're super powerful and they have long batteries. So why do we care about this? Well, put on my prognosticator hat. What if Apple made a lower end Mac with maybe an A series processor and a small battery in it? They would care about it then, like a low cost Mac. So I wonder if we're setting the grounds for future hardware changes. So something to keep in mind. Apple has continued to make changes in various device management controls. And they've basically started the process a couple years ago of migrating from MDM to DDM, mobile device management to a declarative device management. And what's the difference here? Basically, MDM was designed for the original iPhone, and it came to the Mac in macOS 10.7 Lion. And it was in the era when servers were powerful and computers and devices were not. So there was a lot of the server is the authority, and the client will check in to say, what do I need? Anything for me, anything for me. The client didn't have a lot of intelligence. DDM is a new way of managing devices where the client actually has some say. The server may send a declaration that says the firewall is on. This is theoretical, not how it actually works. And if the user somehow manages to disable the firewall, the client, because it has a declaration, can say, oh, look, the firewall's supposed to be on, let me turn it back on. So we're getting to a point where the clients are more intelligent, and it's kind of re-architected things. So one of the big changes in macOS 26 is they've deprecated the software update controls. They're moving those to DDM. The existing controls will still work on macOS 26, but not macOS 27. So what does that mean? Well, make sure that your MDM supports DDM. Some on-premise solutions, I will not name and shame, do not and will not. So in that particular case, you either need to migrate to a cloud MDM or migrate to a different MDM. As was touched on in the Apple presentation, there are some new management controls for Safari, and this is not only macOS, but also iOS and iPadOS, where it'll make it easier for you to do things like deploy default bookmarks or home pages, start pages, and you can control whether the users can clear their browser history, use private browsing, pop-up settings, can they use Apple Intelligence. If you've used a tool like Chrome or Edge, or even Firefox, you know that the client management abilities of those browsers are quite extensive. One of the biggest ones that I run into, and this is one of my bigger feature requests for Apple, is if I need to authenticate to the site and I have a certificate on my system, I want to be able to basically set a rule that says if this, in this domain, is asking for a cert, pick the one issued by this certificate authority or with the subject or whatever. You can easily do that cert auto selection stuff in Chrome or Edge. There's no mechanism for doing that in Safari. Safari extensions have also been kind of late to the game compared to like Chrome and Edge. They've added some ability to force install, but the whole management scheme of blocking them or running it through some kind of proxy is challenging. Another thing too is that for example, you can do some things to work around the certificate stuff using identity preferences, but those live in the user's login keychain. What if it's a multiple user Mac? With Platform SSO, we're not going to have multiple user Macs, are we? And what happens also to your login keychain quite frequently if you have to reset your password? It can get lost. So you can lose all of your identity preferences and suddenly get prompted for websites and so on. As was touched on, Apple is moving to a declarative app management, which can not only work just with the App Store, or VPP, but also packages as well, where you can enforce, disable, and set automatic updates for apps. The updates can be designated as required or optional. This would have been really useful to me back in the days. I had a really bad Global Protect update once that nearly caused a launch delay because people couldn't connect. It didn't work on iOS, and I couldn't stick to the previous version, which worked. You're always getting the latest with VPP. So, thank you. And there's some additional MDM reporting for declarative app management. But there's also the new app management framework for iOS and iPadOS. This is kind of the successor to the old app config, if any of you have used that. Microsoft, of course, has their own variant of that, for their own apps, their app protection policies. This allows you to deploy a bunch of things in a single workflow and avoid race conditions. Like, how many times have you tried to install something on a Mac that requires a package and a profile? And like, what happens if the profile gets there after the package? It may not be licensed or configured properly, and the user gets dialogues and no. So this would be something that would be great to have. Would also be better for multiple user Macs. Get away from the whole user channel MDM.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
All right. So, as was touched on in the Apple presentation, there is a new content filtering mechanism built in the OS. It's designed to help you, it's privacy preserving, as was discussed, and it's designed. There are some tools out there now, like Cisco Umbrella, that can do this sort of thing, but they don't use the latest Apple frameworks, and they're not privacy preserving. So, this is something that if you have a content filter, you're going to want to ask them if they're going to support the new filtering mechanism and when. All right. Big topic for macOS 26, platform SSO. The general rule of thumb with Apple is it takes them 3 iterations of a new technology to get it to a point where it's usable. There's the first version, which kind of sort of works, but has a lot of limitations. The second version is usually much better, but it still has a couple of problems. The third version is usually usable. Actually, Platform SSO, this is now the 4th iteration, in macOS 26. And the biggest feature, of course, is the ability to have this appear in Setup Assistant through automated device enrollment. More context on it in a minute. This will allow you to create a local account on the fly. It can also be that guest account. There's 2 methods of authentication with Platform SSO. If you've used like Kerberos SSO, you've probably used password sync, where you may be dealing with 80 or if you use the Microsoft SSO with Entra, where you're synchronizing your local account MAC password. You're not binding, but you're synchronizing that password to your identity provider. This is the one that I think a lot of people default to. If you read the tea leaves, what Apple and Microsoft are saying is use the secure enclave method, Luke, because it's more secure. And the thing that's mind-bending for a lot of organizations is you can't have both secure enclave and password sync. It's an either or. So what do? Well, the recommendation is treat the Mac like a mobile device, and you give it a passcode profile rather than a password profile. So 6, 7, 8 character PIN. How many times how many tickets do you get from people who forget their password and then lock themselves out of their Mac and then have to boot into recovery and then they ask for their file vault key, and tens of thousands a year. So in theory, the passcode should be a little bit simpler to address, and you should be able to easily clear or reset that passcode via MDM as well. As was touched on, the authenticated guest mode is nice as long as your computer is able to reach the identity provider, i.e. it's on the network. The one caveat with the authenticated guest mode is it's like a normal guest account on macOS. Nothing is permanent. The data is transient. So if you are creating files locally, you be prepared to lose them. Also, if you have the appropriate badge reader and badge, you can use tap to log in. Or you can potentially also use an NFC iPhone or with your employee badge on it to also authenticate. So what does platform SSO mean for the old 80 binding? Well, it still, in theory, works in macOS 26. I wouldn't bet that it's going to work in macOS 27. So if you're still dependent on a workflow that depends on 80 binding, you really need to investigate platform SSO. Also, the Kerberos SSO is now deprecated as well. You can use Cloud Kerberos with platform SSO. I think the general thing, and this is a conversation Marcus and I have had with platform SSO, is there's so many people who are like itching to get it. So like as soon as macOS 26 releases, I'm gonna use it at Setup Assistant. No, you are not. In order to do that, you need two things. You need your MDM provider to support it, and you need your identity provider to support that. Microsoft has no timetable for when they're going to do it. It wouldn't surprise me if it's done by the end of the year, but it isn't going to be September. I know some of the MDM vendors are supporting it initially, but what OS bugs will be found or what issues will there be with their initial thing that will require further iteration. So this is something, if you have a test MDM environment and test server, you can start potentially playing with, but you really need that identity provider piece. And you have to think about how you're going to what about all the people who are out there? You're going to make people re-enroll their systems. How are we going to address that? And there's a bunch of other things. If you're part of a large organization, you may have to create like security architecture documents to describe how platform SSO works and why you want to use it in place of what you have. There are a few other miscellaneous changes to macOS. There's a new recovery assistant. I have not personally experienced this yet in the recovery environment. Apple has a macOS virtualization environment built in to Apple Silicon Mac's virtualization framework. It's an interesting tooling. It allows you to do things like UTM, or there's a bunch of different tools that let you run virtual environments. They've actually now added the ability to do Docker-like containers. This is something I would keep an eye on. I wouldn't necessarily plan on throwing Docker out today, but maybe again in a couple of years if this works out. Also related to this, they have a new sparse image format, as if, for use for virtualization. So instead of like declaring a disk image that's taking up a gig of your hard drive space, it can just use what's needed. In the past, we've also had warnings that Ruby, Perl, and Python were deprecated, going to be removed from the OS. Well, Python 2 did go away. Ruby and Perl are still there. We also got the message about kernel extensions. Don't use them, but they're still present. They still work. Don't bet on it. And we also had the dialogue about CUPS PPDs, going away. They still work in macOS 26. They're still there. But again, especially if you're looking to buy new printers, make sure they support AirPrint or IPP. And then if you use any of the some of the logging tools out there, part of Jam Protect. The audit delogging framework has been deprecated since macOS 14, but it can still be enabled. It still works. I'll talk a little bit about new features in Apple Business School Manager. So as was mentioned earlier, there is an API now for ABM. So you can actually do things like assign and unassigned devices, get information, and so on. There's a link here, somebody who's written a bunch of scripts already to help handle the authentication for you. An administrator has to create that API account, not a device enrollment manager. Some new restrictions around managed Apple accounts. So last year, Apple gave us part of the puzzle. Allow your managed Apple account. So you federated your domain with Apple Business Manager. So any of your employees can sign in with basically their identity provider into device. So how do you keep them from signing into their personal phone? Well, last year Apple gave you controls that said you can only do this on managed devices. So this year, Apple's given us the other control, which is now I could still sign into my enterprise device with a personal Apple account. So now we have this control where we can prevent, you can only sign into a managed device with a managed Apple account. However, this isn't all or nothing. So one of the challenges here is these controls aren't granular enough. And I'll give you the example. I have a company managed iPhone. I have access to the App Store. If I want to download it from the App Store, I cannot use my managed Apple account. I have to use a personal account. What if this control is set so that I can't sign into my device with my personal account? I can't buy any apps from the App Store. So I would hope that this is something we see change in a future version of macOS. Okay, for those who've gone through the process of federating, how fun is that? Apple will tell you, you have 3,000 people with a company.com domain, but they won't tell you who they are for privacy reasons. And so a lot of people push back on it. And a lot of organizations would do things like use, some kind of, email, if they were using some kind of appliance, they could intercept that email from Apple and see who is being sent to and then parse that list and then contact those people directly. Starting this fall, you'll be able to obtain a list of existing Apple accounts with the caveat that only if they've signed into specific services like developer. So if Marcus has a company.com email account he signed into Apple Music for, I'm not going to see that email. But if he signed into Apple Developer with it, I will see that, and I'll know that it's him. So then, when the user, when you do the actual federation process, the user will be given the option: do I want to convert my existing account to a managed account, or is this like a personal account that I bought stuff from the App Store on, and I want to convert it to my own personal email? There are some improvements in the granular role controls in Apple Business Manager and Apple School Manager. Device enrollment managers used to be able to do a lot of things. You can make that less. As someone who has had somebody accidentally unassign and release all of the Apple devices in an organization, I welcome this. And if you're using Apple School Manager, a site manager has some restrictions as well. Starting this fall, you'll actually be able to get warranty information out of Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. If anybody has played with GSX integration, GSX is Apple's global service exchange. And it's really, the GSX people hate customers directly. So trying to get this set up was a pain, and there was a really convoluted process to get this associated with their MDM. And so basically, this is going to solve a lot of problems for a lot of people as long as when Apple provides it and the MDM providers are able to query it. So let's talk a little bit about testing, which hopefully you guys have been doing for a couple months. So you obviously want to test to see how the new features and functionality affects your environment. And do my apps work? Can my users work? Can I VPN? Does my endpoint security tool work? You want to support that new OS as close to release as possible. In the past, we had the ability to just permanently defer updates. So we're going to stay on macOS 15. It's been quite a while now that the maximum deferral is 90 days. So, if you're not able to support it right away, you better be ready to support it within 90 days. And keep also in mind that Apple does not generally, Apple treats things differently than Windows. When new hardware is released, it typically requires the latest OS or even a newer version of the current OS. So, any new hardware that is not going to run macOS 15. It's going to run 26, so you need to support it. I always view this time of year when the new OSs are coming out. This is a really good time to like take a look at the overall state of your environment. Make sure everything's documented. What exactly happens to my machine when I enroll? What software is installed? What settings are profiled? What's in scope? How does the user authenticate? And so on. You should have that run book. And you should also identify if there's certain people in your organization that are responsible for different tools like endpoint security, or maybe even like the Office apps, that you have those folks identify who those people are, because you want to loop them in the testing. You want them doing the testing. There are a number of resources that help you. If you're not a MacAdmin Slack, you need to be. Now, while there is a macOS 26 channel, it's pretty bare bones right now because the OS is technically still under NDA, even though there is a public beta. But there is a private channel where the new OSs are discussed. You have to prove that you have access to Apple Business Manager or School Manager to be able to go into that private channel. So if you go into the Appleseed channel, there'll be instructions there that usually means DM one of these 4 people with a screenshot of your Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager account, and they will add you to the channel. The channel is an invaluable resource. The people are constantly posting new things. Hey, the newest Beta 8 came out and I'm finding this broke, or my Bluetooth keeps disconnecting, or so on. There's a lot of, it's not just you alone against the universe here. A lot of times people will also post things, although not NDA related, in the Apple feedback channel, requesting features and so on. There's also the Apple Dev RSS channel, which tells you anytime a new Apple OS is released, whether it's release or beta. So if you're using Slack, you want to have this channel favorited and starred. There's a genuine pattern for these betas. Every 2 weeks, there's a new beta up until we get into, it's usually on a Monday and Tuesday US time, which might be Tuesday, Wednesday, Australian time, since you guys are in the future. As we get later in the beta cycle, the betas become weekly. And you want to upgrade, you want to look at the release notes. And again, this is always a good time to look and see what you're doing. Another pitch for macOS Security Compliance Project, build your own security baseline for your organization. MSCP is great because it not only does it let you pick and choose what controls you want to implement, build your security baseline, but it'll also generate the guidance. So it'll actually give you the profiles, the scripts to set these settings. It'll also allow you to refactor all of your existing profiles so you're not deploying 43 payloads in a single monolithic profile. And things like that. Future you will thank you for making your profiles more granular. When you're testing, you're going to use the feedback system app. You want to make sure you fill out the infrastructure survey. So Apple has a kind of a guidance of what you are. We're a Microsoft shop. We're an Okta shop. We're a Google shop. So on. I know when I was looking at it, there was a lot of questions about who are you using as your Wi-Fi provider? No clue. I don't work in an office, so I don't know. Just do your best. So the place where you get a lot of your information is the Appleseed for IT site. It's beta.apple.com/for-IT. Don't go to beta. It used to be beta.apple.com/IT. If you go to that URL now, all of your Apple pages will display in Italian. So you don't want. I've done that. You don't want to do that. Apple has done a really good job with macOS 26. They have brand new test plans that are really awesome. So if you haven't looked at these yet, strongly encourage you to go do that once you log into the site. There's also a device migration test plan. There's API test plan. There's beta profiles and things like that. Super useful. And that's also where the Mac evaluation utility can be downloaded from. You'll want to run that at least once at every site that you manage, because you may find things you didn't know were wrong, like Apple hosts being blocked or inspected. The age-old question of, do I test on a virtual machine or a physical machine? In the past, we had, with things like VMware Fusion and Parallels, we could basically steal a serial number from an existing Mac and test an automated device enrollment workflow. But there were some security concerns with that, so Apple has basically closed that loop, and it's no longer available. So you can still run a virtual machine, and this might be a good thing for the first beta, run a VM on your Apple Silicon Mac, to let you get feel your way around the interface, the changes, see the changes in Spotlight, and and so on, and kind of get your feet wet without actually upgrading your OS. But really, I think for most people, you're going to be better off testing on a physical hardware. Particularly, the only way to test an automated device enrollment workflow. Also note that if you're doing anything with Apple accounts, you can get in really strange problems. In theory, with macOS 15, you're supposed to be able to use to test Apple accounts in a VM on a Mac. But of course, the thing they never actually came out and said is make sure you're using the same Apple account both on the physical hardware as well as the virtual machine, or else you're going to run into problems. It's not going to work. So my recommendation is always use, for the first 2 or 3 betas, you at least want to be using a test device. As we get deeper into the cycle, as long as you are not running any showstopper issues, should probably start living on the OS. And so should all the people, all the app owners and all the people on your team and the security teams and so on, should be living in the new beta OS. In the past, this was a lot more iffy than it is today. Apple seems to have put an emphasis on making the betas relatively stable. Keep in mind there's a lot of debug code in there, so the performance may not be great, your battery life may not be great, but it only becomes problematic if you see those things still happening as we get to the last betas or the release candidate. Of course, you always want to back up your data, right, Jordy? I see this every year. The new beta comes out, somebody's on macOS 15 and wants to do like a DFU restore to get a machine to macOS 26, and they're using configurator and it fails. One of the things, every new OS has updated device support. So if you're on the older OS, you're trying to do a DFU restore of a device, whether it be iOS, macOS, whatever, it's going to likely fail with configurator until you install the updated device support, which is embedded in the Xcode beta. So install Xcode beta, launch it, install the support files, and then configurator should work. There's 2 different methods to actually get a device enrolled into beta. First, the user can go into system settings and log in and pick the appropriate beta program. Of course, there's like developer beta, public beta, Apple seed beta, or customer seed. Or new in macOS 15.4 and later, you can actually deploy a configuration profile to an endpoint. I think HCS Online has a guidance on how to do that for Jamf. Microsoft has a page on how to do it for Intune. This is not something that we were able to personally use this year because of the late arrival of it, but hopefully for next year. Because just trying to get people into the right program, choose the right one, is challenging. So we'll talk about filing feedback to Apple. So this is the actual mechanism that you report issues to Apple. You can do it 3 different ways. Every device that's running a beta OS has the feedback assistant on it. You can also go to feedbackassistant.apple.com, or you can type Apple feedback / in a browser window. Really important thing. Be careful what Apple account you use to file feedback. You ideally want to use the same account that you used to sign into Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager, because there's different teams at Apple that look at the feedback. If you use a developer account and file feedback, the enterprise team never sees it. And the developer team was like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. So you need to make sure you do that. Of course, there's no actual controls on like forcing you to do this. You can't deploy a profile to force feedback assistant to only use the managed Apple account. Make sure you file it as an organization. By default, even if you're signed in with that managed Apple account, it will, when you create new feedback, it'll be defaulted as personal. But if you're part of a team, you want to have that feedback so other people on your team can see it, respond to it when you're on PTO, things like that. Or even just see, did somebody file feedback about this issue? Oh yeah, Jeremy did, okay. Make sure you're testing against the correct seed. They're generally the same, but use Apple seed or customer seed. Don't use the developer seed or the public beta. Pro tip, if you're doing something with macOS 26 and you run into an issue, the first thing you should do is go into Feedback Assistant and create new feedback. Because when you do that, it'll actually create like a system report, but it'll also include that sysdiagnose file. What's a sysdiagnose? It's a giant log file that contains all sorts of information about your system, logs, and so on. The idea being, even if you don't actually get around to like writing up the details of the issue, by starting that process there, you've created a sysdiagnose around the time whatever it was you were doing happened. So it's less difficult for Apple to like go through the logs and figure out when this actually happened. Make sure you use an appropriate title when creating your feedback. Writing tools, Apple Intelligence can actually, if you can use them, are actually helpful for this. Another pro tip: if you choose the option to use something not on this list, like the category, giant black hole may not get looked at. Why does it exist in the first place, then, is my question. Nobody could give me that answer. So it's better off to pick something that's closely related, but maybe not right, where somebody will actually see it and move it to the correct location, than to put it in this giant, big, miscellaneous bucket. So your feedback should look like this. What are you trying to accomplish specifically? Not just, I did X and Y happened. Well, why were we doing X? Well, I was trying to do this because. What did you do? How did you do? Well, I deployed this package and then I had this script run to do that. What did you expect would happen? What actually happened? Is this a one-time issue, or can you repeat this? Really important too with Apple because they'll prioritize fixes based on the number of people reporting it and the number of affected devices. So if you say, hey, we have 10,000 Macs and we can't upgrade if this isn't fixed. I know sometimes the frustration points are high and the tendency is want to curse and swear. Don't do that, because your stuff will just get trashed. And if you're working on macOS 26 and you file feedback, say this is broken in beta 3 and beta 4 comes out, go update the feedback, say tested in beta 4, still broken. Don't create new feedback. macOS has really nice built-in screen recording and screenshot abilities. Use those copiously when you're trying to report these issues to Apple. Another pro tip: if you haven't ever done this, when you do a screen recording, those files can get very large. Run it through Handbrake with the default settings. It'll make the files 1/10 the size. So if your organization has an AppleCare Enterprise OS support contract, when you find a bug that's concerning or an issue, that something's not working correctly in an OS release, the first thing you should do is file feedback. And Apple does ask you when you're filing feedback, do you have an ACE? Do you have an AppleCare? What's your customer number? Of course, I can't set that default via profile, which would be a nice feature to have. So file that feedback first, because when you open an AppleCare case, what's the first thing they ask you for? Well, can you get us a sysdiagnose? Can you do this? Well, what happens is you create feedback. Those things are created automatically. So you're ahead of the game already if you do the feedback first and then you open the AppleCare case second, because a lot of the info they're going to ask you for is already provided in that feedback. And the support engineers have access to feedback. If it's a critical issue for your organization, you can use the terminology deployment blocker. That's not something that's necessarily available outside of the major OS beta cycle of June through September, but use that liberally. And then if it's a really significant issue, you can talk to your Apple account executive or system engineer and leverage what's called voice of the customer, where you say, hey, look, this is really bad, and if you don't fix this, it's going to be a big problem for not just our organization, but a lot of other ones. So if it's something that you filed feedback on macOS 15 and it's something that's not addressed in macOS 26 and you'd like it to be, that's when you want to create new feedback. Because a lot of times those old feedbacks kind of get purged once the OS once the OS gets out of its major development cycle. And another thing, I know some orgs that have stopped filing feedback. Well, Apple never responded. It's like, oh, they read it. If they wanted you to do something, they would have replied. Or if they wanted clarification, they would have replied. So just because you file it and it seems like it was a black hole doesn't necessarily mean that it did. But, if you file feedback on something, when Apple comes back to you and says, hey, can you test it against the latest beta, be sure to be timely on that, because they have a limited attention span to things. And so when you can complete that cycle better, you'll be able to, it'll be better. Greater chance your issue is going to get addressed before the OS releases. So the best time to begin testing, filing feedback on macOS 26 is yesterday. The second best time is now. So that's the end of my formal presentation. We can now open up to the floor for questions.
At which point do you upgrade your production Mac to the new release?
We're an organization that generally requires people to upgrade within, if it's a non-security release, 30 days. If it's a security release, it could be 14 or 7 days, depending on the severity. Bear in mind, I have been, I think since beta 4 or 5, I've been running on my daily driver, basically after the middle of July. And so I haven't updated to the last beta because, there'll be a new one that'll be released tomorrow because the US is on holiday today, so Apple's a day late, but we're getting close to the point where there'll be a release candidate. So, when those updates, when those betas are out, when the release version up, I'm updating that same day and living on that because I want to make sure there's not an issue.
Robert, we went through the whole federated thing. Mm-hmm. And I've still got users coming out of the woodwork 18 months later going, oh, what do I do with this temporary login account thing that I have to do something with because it's really annoying. And I think we still haven't got the whole managed account thing set up properly. It's a little confusing for a noob like me. What advice do you give, or where's the best place to start to kind of wrap your head around it?
Trying to think if there's an actual presentation is on. There's a lot of things Apple could do to make the whole process better. Managed Apple accounts were designed originally to address just like a shared use environment in education, and now it's been adopted by enterprise. But there's a lot of things like we can't do any e-commerce on a managed Apple account, and so on. You can do a lot of developer things related with managed Apple accounts, but test flight, for example, if you have to test a macOS or iOS, iPadOS app, you can't use the managed Apple account to sign into test flight. So there's a whole bunch. There are a lot of things. I think in general, some of the best documentation is in the Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager references to kind of review. But also, I think the best thing to do is to kind of play with double check your settings and take a look at all people who are coming to you and what kind of account they have and what resources they need to ask. Can this be accomplished with a managed Apple account? Must they use a personal account? Do you allow them to use a personal account? Yeah,
and do the managed accounts end up looking like iCloud and all that kind of stuff? Even if they've got like a company iPhone as well, like it all joins together.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So I could put this presentation on my iCloud drive. Then access my phone if I have enough space, which of course you can't buy more space if you're an enterprise. It's like Apple's leaving money on the table, not having that there. So maybe.
As someone who's basically the lone Mac admin for a small to medium company, what is the immediate action items you would probably address in this new Mac update?
Besides making sure obviously you want to test your enrollment workflow to make sure everything works correctly for new devices, or if somebody wipes their Mac and needs it get re-enrolled. I think the background task management controls are one of the biggest things people have to make sure are present. And again, just having that documentation too of your process. Those are probably the biggest three things I would identify. The assumption is that you may want to look at things like platform SSO down the road, but that's not I have to have this done before the OS ships.
If I've got platform SSO set up, but we've got a pretty big migration happening from binded AD Macs, what's the best way to migrate from binded AD Macs to platform SSO?
That's going to be that's an interesting question. A lot of the emphasis this year has been on new setups, but for example, like one of the pieces that I would like to see is a command line method, through app SSO to basically force a client. So I could script it, that when the user's ready, they could go into a company portal, self-service, whatever, and execute this, which runs a script which prompts that does all the legwork. Some of that stuff is still not there yet. So you're definitely going to want to test that migration process and figure out what works best in your environment, before you just we're going to deploy the profiles and push everybody over.